Welcome to the first online lecture for Introduction to C#. Before we're able to actually start learning C#, we need to download an application that's called an IDE. That stands for Integrated Development Environment. What an application such as an IDE lets us do is it lets us write code, but more importantly, it will build the code into an application so we can see what our code is doing for us. The program that we're going to be using in this course is Visual Studio 2010 Express, specifically the C# version. This is a free program that you're able to download at no charge, and specifically it will be used for C#. If you have the professional or developer versions, you will be able to write applications in all of these different languages. But since it's free, Microsoft has targeted it towards a specific language. The link to this will be in the comments section of the video. Once you get to this page, you're going to want to click on this link here to expand that out, and we have Visual C# 2010 Express. Now, you're going to see versions for 2012 out there as well. All of the computers that we have on campus are still on 2010, and for the sake of consistency for this course, we'll be using Visual C# 2010 Express. Once you expand this out, verify that English has been selected and click the Install Now link. The installer itself is relatively small. Once completed, run it. And for the most part, the installation is pretty straightforward. When asked, always accept the default settings. And what it's doing at this point is it's going to be taking care of doing some initial setup, and then it's going to download the rest of the program because it is quite a bit larger than just 3 megs. And you'll see me at some point during this install. I will actually pause the video so that you don't have to watch my progress bars go up. As it gives us the setup screen, if you'd like to help improve the install experience for everybody, you can leave this checked. I usually uncheck it. And I'll hit next. Accept the licensing terms. The default install is going to be on your C drive. And now this is the part where it will be downloading the rest of the application from the internet. And depending on your connection speed, your experience will vary with this. I'm going to pause this again until the download is complete. After everything has completed, you should see this Setup Complete screen and click Exit. And now you will have in your Start menu, All Programs, scroll down, Microsoft Visual Studio 2010 Express. You click that item and you will have it launch. The first time it starts up, it will load some user settings. You'll see the progress bar run. And this is the screen that you will see when you load up Visual Studio from your Start menu every time. If you already have some existing projects that you've worked on before, you'll see them over here in the Recent Projects area. So this is our Integrated Development Environment. This is a Microsoft product for C#, which is part of the Microsoft.NET platform. We'll be talking more about what that actually means, but to start, let's see what it would take to start and create a very simple program. Over here, you'll see an item for New Project. And what's interesting about the way that Microsoft has designed it is that they'll give you many different ways to sort of do the same thing. And depending on what works best with how you like to navigate your programs, you can do it how you like. You can click on this link to create a new project, or you can go to File and select New Project from there as well. I'm going to select this one, and we're going to be given a window that gives us all these different choices. For what we will be doing in this class, we will be creating Windows Forms applications. You'll see that below this there are many other different types of projects. These are all varying types of C# applications that you can build. What we are interested in is this Windows Forms application, and by default it's going to have that selected for you. Down here for name is what our application is going to be called. So the first application that we will create, I'm going to call Hello World. Once I've entered that in, I'll hit the OK button. And you may or may not get an error message. I'm thinking you will not get this one. This is specific to something that I've installed on my computer. Regardless, we'll say yes. And this will load up our application for the first time. What we get when we create an empty Windows Forms application project is just that. This rectangle here represents the form, or sort of the background or the canvas of what our application is going to have on it. Think of it as a blank piece of paper that we'll be writing on. Here is where we will put various text boxes and buttons and labels that we'll be working with through for the most of the semester. But let's take a tour of some of the things that we're looking at. Along the top here we have different menu items. Primarily we're going to be concerning ourselves with the File menu and the Debug menu as well. And we'll talk more about what all of these things mean. Here in this larger area will be sort of our workspace. Anything that we're going to be doing is going to usually take place in this window. That's why this one's the largest. Right now, the window that is open that shows our blank form has the word Design in it. And we call this one the Designer. And this is where we will be taking care of the visual elements that show up on our application. To the left of that, there's a side navigation bar, and there's an item called Toolbox. And if you put your mouse over the toolbox, it will fly out. If you move your mouse off, it will go back over to where it is. You'll see once you mouse over that toolbox that there are all these different things under common controls. We see there's a button, a checkbox, a label, a list box, a list view, a text box. All of these things are controls that we can put on our form that will help us allow the user to interact with our application. To the right of this workspace window, to the right of our designer, we see there is another window, and you can tell what the window is by at the top it will have the name of the window. This one is called the Solution Explorer. How Visual Studio organizes your application and the files that make up your application is at the very top. The entire thing that is open inside of Visual Studio is called a solution. You'll see below it, directly below it, there's a little bit of an indentation, and that means that this here is part of our solution. And you'll see that the solution is called the same thing that we picked when that dialog opened up in the middle. Directly below a solution, we would say that this is a project. And the project is the closest thing that would equate to an application. The project is actually what will build and create an application for us. The solution is a container for all of these things. Next to these items, you'll see that there's a black triangle here. It's pointed slightly down. And below that, there are white triangles pointing directly to the right. Whenever you see one of these items, that means that you can click on it and it's going to expand out. And when it is expanded, it turns black and points down. If I were to click on that again, it will collapse that back up. Same with this one. We want to expand this out, and we're for now going to ignore properties and references and concentrate on this right here. This form1.cs is what's already open in our designer. To prove this, over in our designer, next to where it says form1.cs, I can click the X, and that's going to close that down. Inside my Solution Explorer, if I were to double click on Form 1, it will open that back up. One of the hardest things about learning a new application like Visual Studio 2010 is when everything starts up the first time, it's right where you would expect it to be. But whether you click the wrong button or maybe press a key or close something down, the hardest part is trying to remember how to get it back to where it was. And so those are tips that we'll be working on throughout the semester. But the biggest one is to say, well, where did my form go? And if you do close it down or the window gets lost somehow, double clicking on Form 1 is how you would open that up. Now, this isn't a very exciting application so far, but it's still our first application, so we're happy with it. To get an application in its state now, this is our project, but to get it so that it's actually a program that runs, we need to build it. And often that word will be used synonymously with compile. And to get an application to compile, we will use Visual Studio's compiler. And we don't need to worry about how it works or exactly what it is that's going on. But what it does do is it takes what we've built here in our designer or any code that we wrote and it compiles it down to assembly language and machine code. And what that means is that the way we're looking at it now, it makes sense to us, but it's not of much use to a computer that wants to run it. And when we build something, it compiles it down to ones and zeros, so it's something that the computer can understand. So to do this, the best shortcut is on your keyboard and you press F5. And you'll see some things happening. Maybe you'll see an output window or your cursor change into that waiting cursor. But when it's done, you'll see that a window will pop up. And if you haven't done anything else, you will see that it is called Form 1 like it was before, but this is now a separate application from what we were doing in Visual Studio. It's a real window, much like any other application that you would run on your operating system. Here's the title up here. We have the minimize, the maximize, and the close button. We can put our mouse over one of the corners. We can resize it just like we would any application. And that's what a Windows Form application is. The majority of the programs that you run on your computer are in fact Windows Forms applications. And that's what we're building because it's a great platform. It does have benefits over some of the other project types, and it's a great way to learn C#. Now, you'll notice, let's say if we were to minimize this here, we have the way our Visual Studio looks. Now it looks a little different. We'll see that our Solution Explorer over here is gone. This window is wider, and up along top you'll see that it says Hello World running. And often what will happen is you'll try and change something in your designer, in your code, and you'll get an error message because the application is still running. Or you'll see that some of the buttons are grayed out. That's because the application is running. Even if you can't see it, it is there. And so you'll see down on your taskbar we have this icon here. That's our application. And pay attention to what happens to Visual Studio when I close this down. Our solution window comes back over, and this is no longer running, and we'll see we have some other buttons. Now, I used F5 to run the application. You can pull the debug button down. And pull my debug button down, and I'll see there is an item on here called Start Debugging. And you can see over here it says F5 because that is the keyboard shortcut that I can press that will do the same thing. And clicking Start Debugging will build my program again and run it. I can also click this button here. It's a little green triangle, looks like a play button, and that will have the same effect. If you want to build your program, but you don't want to run it, maybe you want to see if you have any errors or anything like that, you can select Build Solution or press F6, and that will have the same effect. Depending on your configuration, you'll get a message down here it says Build Succeeded. Now we haven't really done much that's interesting, and one of the things we're going to want to do before we put any extra work into this is we want to make sure that we've saved our work properly. Now by default, every time you build your program it will save, but this is special because we haven't really saved this and closed it down yet. So what we want to do the first time is we're going to go and we're going to select Save All. And the first time you do this, it's going to ask you for a location. Now those of you who are using Visual Studio Professional or Visual Studio Developer, these options will be available the first time you create the project. But because we're using Express, it's going to be a little different of experience for us. Now, by default, it's going to attempt to put this into your user folder and your documents folder. There's a subfolder there called Visual Studio 2010. This will not be the same on all campus computers, and usually what I will do is I will click the Browse button and I will go on the left hand side here and I will pick Desktop. If you have a flash drive, I would say to save it the first time on your flash drive as well. So we have selected Desktop, and now you can see it says C Users Joe Desktop, and by default this checkbox is going to be selected and it says Create Directory for Solution. You want this because that directory is going to be what you need to make sure that you copy when you're either submitting your program or if you wanted to move it over onto a flash drive or something like that. So everything looks good. I'm going to hit Save. And now we are ready to go. And I would recommend that you always do this before you start working. The worst thing that can happen is you won't pay attention to where it's saved, or something will save wrong, and then when you open your application up again, maybe you're missing a file or your project files are broken a little bit. So I would always say make sure this happens the first time. Now, if you are inside Visual Studio and you don't know the directory that you've saved in after doing all of this, a shortcut for that is to click on the solution in the Solution Explorer, right click, and I'm not seeing that on there. I think we're missing that. Let's try a different one. Select your designer, right click, and you can see Open Containing Folder. And I believe this would be a limitation of Express versus Professional. But what this will do is it will open up the folder in Windows Explorer, and mine opened in the other window. And this is the folder that you just created. These are all the files that make up your application. There's nothing magical about it. It's very much the same on how if you were to save a Word document, it creates a file on your file system as well. But the thing that is different about these is you need to have all of these files in the right spot, or the next time you open it, it might not work as well. So to experiment and make sure that we did create it right, I'm going to leave this window open, and behind it I'm going to close down Visual Studio. And so what we have here is we're left with our file system. This folder here corresponds to our project name. We want to go one up into our solution. And you'll see here there is a hello world.sln file. SLN stands for solution. This is sort of the master file that you need to click if you would like to open up the project that we just created. So double clicking on that should bring up our solution. And I'm still getting that error message, but you will not. And then go to Debug, Start Debugging to make sure if it builds again, then everything has been set up correctly. Let's work through a scenario in which we created our application on the desktop and we wanted to move it over to a thumb drive or a flash drive. We know that we saved our solution in a folder on our desktop. So I can close this down, Visual Studio. If you're going to move it, you always want to close the solution down, or you're going to get error messages that something is using one of your files. And mine is right here on the desktop in a folder called Hello World. That name is always going to be the same as whatever you initially gave your project name as. Opening up my computer, my thumb drive is going to be my G drive. It's going to be different for you depending on what your computer is set up as. But at the easiest, I can take this folder and I can drag it right onto my thumb drive. And depending on your settings, you'll get a copy of it on your desktop and you'll get a copy of it over here on your flash drive. What I would say before deleting this is to go on here and open it up and make sure it still works. And to make sure it still works, if we don't get error messages when we start and start debugging, we have our form there. And I would always say to do that before deleting the original one. One of the things that can be the most confusing about application development is when you make copies of your code and you don't know which one it was that you were working in. So if you were to work on it on your desktop and then turn one in, say, that you were working on your thumb drive, that may not be the most recent one. So it takes a certain amount of discipline to make sure you're always working in the right one. Now, although this application here is on our thumb drive, it doesn't make it any different than the one that's on our desktop. We can still open this up, and I'm going to get that error message again. We can still open this up and we can work on it from our thumb drive just as if we would anywhere else. And I would suggest, if that is the route that you go, to just make sure that that's the folder that you are working from and you pay attention to that when you were to turn one in. As always, I would suggest backing up your code somewhere. Things do happen. Thumb drives do go bad. And some of these applications you may spend quite a bit of time on. So it would be a shame for you to lose your work. Now, in your directory that you're storing your application in, you'll see that that initial folder name is Hello World. And when you go in, there's another folder called Hello World and a Hello World SLN. And sometimes you'll be in a hurry and you're trying something out and you don't really know if that's the application that you're going to keep. And you may just choose the default name. It may be something like Windows Application 1 or Test Project or blah. And you're going to say, well, that's not really what I wanted to call it. And you'll go in and you say, I just don't like this folder name. I'm going to call it something else. I'll just say Best Program Ever. And you'll be changing this in your file system. When you go in and you attempt to open that up, you're going to get an error message like this, and it's going to say one or more projects in the solution were not loaded correctly. You hit OK, and there'll be kind of this will look right, but there'll be kind of a ghost version, right? It'll say Hello World unavailable, or whatever your project is. This is because you cannot change these file names from Windows Explorer. The SLN file has what we would call paths in it, so that it's looking for a Hello World. It's not smart enough to know that, well, this is the same folder that was there before, and it's just going to make a guess. Computers aren't very good at guessing. I'm going to change this name back. If you want to change the name of something, you would want to change it from inside Visual Studio. And you can change just about any of these. And if you wanted to, you right-click off of the item you want to change and you select Rename. And let's say I'll call this one Hello World Solution. I'll hit Enter. Right-click this one. And I'll call this one Hello World Project. And it's going to work just like it did before. Hit Start. And the application will still build. If you'd like to change the form name, rename, and you have to be a little more careful with these. You'll notice that Form 1 ends in a .cs extension. That stands for a C# file. If you remove that extension, and let's say you just wanted to call it Form 1, Visual Studio can no longer tell that that's part of your program. It doesn't know how to build a file that just says Form 1. It expects that CS at the end. So anything before the CS you can rename. And if we wanted to call this one, and we'll go off of what we're supposed to call it, we'll say FRM, that stands for Form, Hello World. Now when you hit enter after this, it's going to prompt you for an additional question. It says, you are renaming a file. Would you also like to perform a rename in this project of all references to the code element Form 1? You will always want to say yes to this. There are connections behind the scenes that allow the program to build. And when you change the name, it's going to want to change those as well. And for everything to keep working correctly, you'll want to rename that properly. This is the end of our first lecture. This shows initial setup and basic Visual Studio navigation. In the next lecture, we will be seeing what it takes to display some very simple controls on our form, and then get into some very basic C# syntax and actually have some things take place on our form when we click a button or when the application starts up the first time.